23-year-old Christa Bramlet was residing in a mobile home in New Providence, Tennessee, in 1996. New Providence, which was formerly a small railroad community, was taken over by the nearby community of Clarksville. New Providence saw rising crime rates over the ensuing years, including an increase in drug-related offenses and commercial burglaries. Christa Bramlet regrettably fell victim to these problems. Her case remained cold until after 22 years when her killer was finally arrested. Christa Bramlet was born in 1973 in California to Jim Langley and Kim Venable. Christa was renowned for being witty, compassionate, and smart. Despite having a tight-knit relationship with her family, she made the decision to be financially independent and started living alone. She and her mother had shared a home together in Clarksville until in 1995, when her mother moved to Corpus Christi, Texas, with Christa's 2 young children. Christa wanted to stay back because she hoped to finish her GED program in Clarksville. She then lived alone in a mobile home while pursuing her high school equivalency so she could provide a better life for her 2 kids. Although her family described her as warm and loving, her neighbor thought she was distant. In the afternoon of October 28, 1996, Christa Bramlet's landlord, Jeff Pennington, knocked on the door of her trailer in the Sunnydale Mobile Home Park just off Peachers Mill Road. The landlord wanted to discuss with Christa about a recent fire outbreak that occurred a week before, but she never responded. Jeff, however, later discovered something terrible while attempting to contact Christa. In the living room, he saw the shoeless body of Christa Bramlet laying in the flickering glow of a small colored television. A terrified Jeff Pennington said, "Then I called the police." Police in Clarksville, Tennessee, were looking into several home killings of women at the time of Christa's murder. Police insisted that the murders had nothing to do with this particle case. When Christa passed away, the Montgomery County Medical Examiner performed an autopsy on her, and the Clarksville Police Department Crime Scene Unit processed the mobile home, looking for any available evidence to pinpoint the killer. According to the autopsy, Christa Bramlet died by suffocation, and a rape kit revealed signs of sexual assault. The forensics sent their DNA findings from the rape kit to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's lab, who then loaded the data from that kit into CODIS in the hopes of finding a match. About 6 detectives began the investigation by interviewing between 50 and 60 neighbors in an effort to identify potential witnesses. A neighbor claimed to have seen Christa on the 27th of October 1996, sitting on her porch as she always did, but Christa had a distant demeanor, and people typically left her alone. Police expected to make an arrest within a week after receiving nearly a dozen tips, but the leads fizzled out, no potential suspects were located, and the years passed without an arrest. Detective Michael Ulrey of the Clarksville Police Department did not receive the news he so wanted until after 22 years in February 13, 2019. It happened that the DNA of the suspect from Christa's rape kit had eventually matched a suspect who was located in Phoenix, Arizona. The DNA on CODIS matched to a 48-year-old man named Kenneth Hudspeth. Detective Michael Ulrey stated that Hudspeth hadn't been mentioned in the investigation up to this point, and no one had noticed him. When Detective Ulrey spoke with the suspect in April, he learned that Hudspeth had indeed lived in the Clarksville at the time of Christa's murder and had left the city in December 1997. Hudspeth didn't deny all the facts presented to him. He claimed to be a friend of Christa, and he allegedly acknowledged being the last person to see her alive. Hudspeth was taken into custody and charged with homicide as a result of the DNA evidence and this interview. He was transferred to Tennessee to await trial after waiving extradition. Investigators learned from Hudspeth's arrest records that he had been detained on multiple occasions for offenses like domestic assault and felony assault. He has served time in jails in Texas and Arizona. His DNA should have been in CODIS years ago, but investigators think the evidence chain of custody may have resulted in lost or ruined swabs. Hudspeth asserted that he had previously done drugs with Christa Bramlet while residing in Clarksville's Sunnydale Mobile Home Park. These allegations were refuted by Christa Bramlet's toxicology report, which revealed a low blood alcohol content. When asked if he had sex with her, he initially denied it, but after seeing the autopsy results and the DNA found inside Bramlet and on her bra, he admitted that he had been so high that he couldn't recall whether or not he had sex with her. "I was on bad dope. I know her. Did I have sex with her? I mean, I don't remember that," Hudspeth said in the courtroom. "I just don't see myself raping and killing this woman." "I hope I didn't," he said again. As soon as there was a break in the case, Christa Bramlet's family members were informed. "I knew all along that it was just a matter of time. There was never a doubt in our minds that they'd find who had done it," Christa's grandmother said. Finally, after long, painful 22 years, in January 2022, 52-year-old Kenneth Hudspeth was found guilty by the judge and was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Christa Bramlet. A 29-year-old mother of two named Mary Mathis Davis vanished without a trace in Lexington on the 30th of May, 1987. The news of her disappearance devastated her family and friends. The following day, her body was discovered behind a nearby supermarket, and the discovery shocked the neighborhood. Despite the police department's best efforts, the case remained unsolved for more than 30 years before a breakthrough in 2023. This case takes us to the city of Lexington in North Carolina. The city of Lexington has a rich and diverse cultural heritage, and its well-known barbecue has earned it the title Barbecue Capital of the World. Beyond its delectable cuisine, Lexington has a charming downtown populated with interesting stores and eateries that reflect the city's warm and welcoming nature. Popular with tourists, the city's historic uptown Lexington neighborhood has beautifully preserved early 19th century buildings. On February 12, 1958, Mary Mathis Davis was born in Lexington, although little is known about her early years. She had a sister named Lisa Hinkle, whom she grew up with. Mary and Lisa had a tight-knit bond in such a way that nothing could separate the both of them. Lisa described her sister as a lovely, compassionate person who never failed to brighten up a room with her contagious smile. Mary was also said to have had a talent for putting people at ease. When the two came of age, Mary got to meet a man named Richard Davis. A spark began to develop between them as they got to know one another, and before they knew it, they were engulfed in a passionate relationship. As their relationship progresses, Richard Davis knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Mary. Mary was overcome with joy when he one day suddenly asked her to be his wife. Without hesitating, she said yes to his proposal. Following the proposal, Mary and Richard started to eagerly make plans for their future as a couple. They talked for hours on end about what their future held, sharing their goals and aspirations for the life they were about to begin. The big day quickly approached, and the couple exchanged vows in a charming and private ceremony. Following the wedding ceremony, Mary and Richard began a new chapter in their lives and eagerly anticipated the journey that lay ahead. The years passed quickly, and Mary and Richard soon had two lovely children. The first child was a boy, and the second, Tracy, was a girl. Mary's heart brimmed with love, and she cherished every second she had with her kids. Later on, she accepted a position at Lexington's Lanier's Ace Hardware store in order to support her expanding family. Mary didn't mind the fact that the work wasn't the most glamorous. She was appreciative of the chance to generate a consistent income. Even though Mary didn't make much money, it was still enough to pay the bills and put food on the table. Mary was determined to give her family the best life she could, despite the difficulties that came with balancing the demands of motherhood and working a job. Life went on at a good pace as the days turned into weeks, then weeks into months. Mary's family was doing well, and she was happy inside, but tragedy was lurking around the corner, ready to strike whenever anyone least expected it. On May 30, 1987, Mary left her house as usual to go to work. Though it seemed like any other Saturday, she had no idea that it would be her last day on Earth. When Mary got to work, she smiled and said hello to her colleagues before starting her day. She eagerly got started on her task. But as the hours passed, she noticed that she was growing hungry and restless. By noon, her tummy was grumbling, and she painstakingly waited for lunchtime. When the time finally came, she was relieved to have the opportunity to leave the four walls of her workplace. She anticipated treating herself to a nice meal. She checked her purse to see if she had enough cash to get herself lunch, and when she was certain she did, she left her store and went to a nearby restaurant. No one would ever again see Mary alive after this. She didn't go back to work again. Once her lunch break was over, her absence became more obvious with each second that went by. Her coworkers couldn't help but wonder what was taking her so long. Their confusion changed into worry as the minutes felt like hours. They knew they needed to find her quickly because there were no indications of her return. One of them offered without hesitation to look for her at the eatery where she went to have lunch. The coworker hurried to the eatery as her heart was racing, but Mary was not there. The staff at the restaurant was of no assistance either, and the situation was getting worse. When the coworker went back to the hardware store, she reported that she could not find Mary at the eatery. As soon as they heard this, the hardware store employees started to feel afraid and realized they needed to act more seriously. They picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number without delaying further. After providing details of what had happened, the police arrived almost immediately. The co-workers also called Mary's husband and parents in order to inform them of what was happening. Police started looking for Mary right away that day, but at first they found nothing. She was completely absent from sight. As words of her disappearance spread, a sense of fear and uncertainty overcame the neighborhood. On the other hand, Mary's family was left to struggle through the pain of not knowing where she was or what had happened to her. But they hoped and prayed that their dear Mary would be found alive and well. That night, Richard had a hard time falling asleep. His thoughts kept him up at night. He had a gut feeling that a serious problem had befallen his family. He realized that Mary's disappearance was not a straightforward case of getting lost in the city because it did not make sense to him. His mind wanders to their kids and how he would look them in the face the following day. Unaware of the potential danger to their mother, the innocent kids had been asking Richard of their mother. The idea of breaking the news to them that she might never return again was too painful for Richard to bear. But he was aware that he needed to be there for his kids all the way. The next morning, as the sun rose, the search for Mary persisted, but it seemed like all the efforts were in vain. Mary's family and the police were anxiously searching for any information about her sudden disappearance. As the day wore on, the police abruptly received a call reporting the discovery of a dead body behind the building of a nearby supermarket called Winn-Dixie. After the call, a small group of police officers rushed to the scene right away. After seeing a small crowd forming around the body's discovery, the police officers moved in to quickly secure the area. The body had clearly been there for some time, as they could see. It was already starting to emit a slight odor of decay. They were able to recognize the body as belonging to Mary Mathis Davis after closer examination. The officers' faces showed shock and disbelief, but they also knew they needed to get to the root of the investigation. There was no immediate indication of the cause of death. So the police started looking around right away for any possible clues. They also questioned the supermarket staff, but none of them appeared to be particularly knowledgeable about what had happened to the victim. The body was then removed for an autopsy after that. One of the policemen showed up at Mary's family's house the day her body was discovered. As the atmosphere was tensed, the officer broke the heartbreaking news to her family. He offered his condolences and shared what little information they had about Mary's incident. The news was indeed a tragic one, as Mary's family was left broken and inconsolable. After a few days, Mary's autopsy results came out, and it was discovered that she was strangled to death. It was also found out that she had experienced sexual assault. As a result of this, Mary's death was classified as a homicide. The authorities started looking into Mary's death as her family was left to mourn and stay strong. The investigators were determined to find the answers to the many unanswered questions they had. Investigators had DNA samples that had been gathered from the crime scene as pieces of evidence, though there wasn't much that could be done with this, due to the lack of advanced DNA technology at the time. Regardless of this shortcoming, detectives diligently pursued every lead and tip that came their way, working day and night. At a point, they appealed to the general public for assistance, with the hope that someone would come forward with information that would help solve the mystery behind the case, but all efforts proved abortive. The detectives felt defeated because it appeared as though the murderer had vanished from the face of the earth. As the days dragged on, becoming weeks and then months, the murderer seemed to have eluded capture. However, Mary's family never lost hope and held on to the belief that justice would eventually be served no matter how long it took. They made an effort to move on with their lives, but the scars from their loss never completely healed. Nearly 25 years after Mary's murder, Lisa, her sister, came out and spoke to the media about the tragedy and pain that she had her family members had to go through when Mary was snatched from them. She spoke candidly to the press about the pain they had experienced and how difficult life had been without her cherished sister by her side. The family had never given up hope that they would one day find the closure they so desperately sought, as Lisa reflected on the happy times they spent together with Mary. Despite the pain and loss, she revealed that the family was not interested in exacting revenge, and that she was prepared to offer Mary's killer forgiveness. A new group of detectives working on Mary's murder case in 2022 made the decision to examine the evidence at hand. They had knowledge about the developments in DNA technology and were confident that, compared to 1987, they now stood a better chance of cracking the case. After that, the detectives then delivered some tangible evidence to the North Carolina State Crime Lab. The North Carolina Bureau of Investigation was contacted to look into the case based on the encouraging results of the analysis of the evidence. From that point on, things accelerated. The Texas-based private forensic genealogy laboratory called Othram was contacted by the State Bureau of Investigation. DNA piece of evidence was then sent to Othram, where scientists were able to create a genealogical profile for potential suspects. The unidentified male suspect was finally identified after months of diligent work. Russell Grant Woods was the name given as the murderer of Mary Mathis Davis. The detectives felt relieved after making the discovery because they were certain that the case had been solved. There was a problem, though. There was no way to bring the murderer to justice because, according to a background check, he had passed away in 2013 at the age of 58. Russell Grant Wood had previously been named as a suspect in the case, but detectives were forced to focus their attention elsewhere at the time due to a lack of sufficient evidence. Not only that, it was, however, learned that Mary and Russell Grant Wood had known each other before her death, although it is unclear what kind of relationship they had. If Russell Grant Wood had still been alive, the state would have moved forward with indictments and accused him of first-degree rape, kidnapping, and murder. Mary's surviving family learned of the case's breakthrough on February 3, 2023. They thanked the detectives for their commitment to the investigation. We prayed that one day we will find the person who violently murdered our beloved Mary. We now have some answers. Although that won't bring Mary back, it does give us a sense of closure. Lori Martin, Mary's niece, told the press. On February 12, 2023, Mary's family held a memorial celebration at Forest Hill Memorial Park in Mary's honor. If she was still alive, that day would have marked her 65th birthday. Mary was a light in this world, and we were blessed to have her as long as we did. She was a loving mother, wife, sister, and friend. We know she is resting easily in the arms of our Lord and Savior, Lori Martin said. There are still many questions that we will never have the answers to, even though the mystery surrounding Mary's death has been solved and the murderer has been found. What sort of connection do you think Mary and Russell had? Post your ideas in the comments section to share with us. The terrifying thing about this case was that an innocent man almost received a false execution. The mysterious death of Darrell Johnson was thought to be resolved for the majority of 2 decades before heartbreakingly resurfacing as a cold case in 2001. 8 a.m. on February 24, 1982, was a typical day for all school children in Nampa, Idaho. That morning, 9-year-old Darrell Johnson was seen walking 6 blocks from her house to the Lincoln Elementary School, but she unfortunately never made it there. Her disappearance sparked reaction from concerned neighbors and friends who, alongside with her family, came out en masse to search for her in the whole of Nampa. However, the massive search for Darrell ended 3 days later when a couple of fishermen found her body near the Snake River in rural Canyon County. According to an autopsy, Darrell had been sexually assaulted and had blunt force trauma to her torso and head. Male DNA and hair were also taken by the police from the crime scene. Almost immediately, 34-year-old Charles Fain was arrested in September on suspicion of raping and killing Darrell. A hair sample that Charles Fain voluntarily provided to the police, combined with the fact that he lived a block away from the Johnsons' family, led to his arrest. Fain denied having any part in the killing of Darrell after being taken into custody, and he also passed the polygraph test. However, despite his denial and him passing the test, he was still accused of killing Darrell Johnson. During his trial, prosecutors hinted at the possibility that a shoe trail discovered close to Darrell's body belonged to Fain. In addition, 2 informants from the prison said they overheard Fain confessing to the crime. The 2 informants also got a shorter jail term in return for their testimony. Fain steadfastly maintained his claim that he was innocent, despite the evidence they mounted against him. He claimed that he was 100 miles away from the neighborhood where Darrell was killed. The other witnesses supported his testimony, but the judge did not rule out Fain as a suspect, despite the absence of solid evidence and no reliable witnesses against him. Charles Fain's polygraph results were accepted as evidence in court, and the DNA technology available at the time was insufficient to establish Fain's innocence. Fain was found guilty on November 4, 1983, and was given a death sentence in March of the following year. But he was later imprisoned for nearly 20 years. In the year 1991, he was only 4 days away from being put to death, but surprisingly, his execution date was postponed. It was then acknowledged 8 years later, in 1999, when DNA technology was a little more developed, that the hair DNA discovered on Darrell Johnson's body did not actually belong to Fain, but rather to an unidentified man. Fain was then cleared right away. He was discharged from the maximum security facility in Idaho in August 1999. Several years later, in 2019, detectives reopened the case, and by the next year, they used genetic genealogy to identify David Dalrymple as a suspect. He was 64 years old, and his DNA matched the sample discovered at the crime scene. Dalrymple was already serving a life sentence for kidnapping and abusing a child in 2004. He was formally charged for killing Darrell Johnson in January 2022. He is still being held in prison and could soon receive a second life sentence or the death penalty. Charles Fain, on the other hand, is happy to be out of bars and is glad that the perpetrator has finally been caught. He was given a sum of $1,400,000 to compensate for his wrongful conviction and the 18 years he spent in prison. Fain recently purchased a truck for himself using part of the money he received for his wrongful conviction. Laura Anne Huizar was born on the 10th of May, 1972, to Judy Marie Huizar and Jose Luis Huizar. She was a 6th grader at Chester, a Moore elementary school, and was just 11 years old when she was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and then brutally killed. Laura vanished on a Sunday afternoon at around 1:30 p.m. on November 6, 1983, as she was making her way home from a friend's house in St. Lucie County, Central Florida. She was last seen at 2G's Market. She had been sleeping over at a friend's house and was walking home with an armful of clothes. When her parents realized that she hadn't returned home, they contacted the friend she had been with and were told that she had left hours ago. Her parents feared the worst. It was unlike Laura to stay on the streets for long. They searched the area, and when they could not find her, they made their way to the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office to report their daughter missing. At the time, officers did not take the little girl's disappearance seriously because, to them, adolescents who do not return home on time are often playing with their friends and have simply lost track of time. Back then, authorities generally did not take reports of missing adolescents seriously until they had been missing for a longer period of time. A massive search was never carried out for Laura, but authorities put up a bolo sheet. Not long, James Howard Harrison, a deputy from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office, came forward and claimed to have seen the little girl walking close to a gas station. It appeared that on the day Laura disappeared, James Howard Harrison was out on patrol. He stated the approximate time he last saw her before claiming to have carried on with his patrol. Although Laura Anne Huizar had a small stature for her age, she was feisty and outspoken. Her family claimed she was very street smart and would never have gotten into a car with a stranger. 3 days after she vanished, on the 9th of November 1983, 2 men discovered Laura Ann's body in a drainage ditch less than 600 yards from the gas station where she was last seen. Her body was sent for an autopsy right away, and asphyxiation was determined to be the cause of her death. She had been raped before being strangled to death. The authorities opened an investigation into the murder case, but they were unable to assemble any tangible proof from the crime scene. After the perpetrator murdered Laura Anne, he then changed the crime scene by putting the body in a drainage ditch to get rid of all the physical evidence. The murderer's actions suggested that he had prior experience handling evidence and crimes. On Laura's body, the police discovered male DNA traces. Since there was no one to match the DNA with at the time, it was kept in a sexual assault kit. The criminal database and DNA technology weren't developed enough back then to give the police any leads about the murderer. The St. Lucie County Police Department's files on Laura Ann's murder case eventually became cold. The St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office created a special cold case squad in 2020, and the team decided to re-examine Laura Ann's case. The investigation was being led by Detective Paul Taylor. The initial investigation had a lot of gaps, which were quickly identified. One of the men who had initially found Laura's body was interviewed by Detective Paul Taylor, who was surprised to be the only officer other than Deputy James Howard Harrison to speak with him. The man remembered that day and the crime scene clearly because, according to him, it had been a terribly traumatic discovery. "I see that little girl lying there every time I close my eyes," the man said. He went on to give Detective Paul Taylor a detailed account of what he had seen that day, but the detective was shocked to learn that his account didn't match the information in Laura Ann's file. "I had already been through the crime scene photos, the case file, and what they're telling me does not match what I'm seeing," said Detective Paul Taylor. He discovered through questioning the witnesses that one of their own deputies had turned the witnesses away and then moved Laura's body away from the initial crime scene. According to the witness, when they called the police to report the discovery of Laura Ann's body, Detective James Howard Harrison was the first officer to arrive at the crime scene. The man claimed that after taking short statements from them, Harrison sent them away. Since then, they were never contacted by anyone from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office regarding the case. It was discovered that before other officers arrived, Harrison spent 20 minutes by himself at the crime scene. The investigation was quick, no suspects were ever named, and the case was promptly filed away for almost 40 years. After hearing this testimony, Detective Paul Taylor decided to take a closer look at Deputy Harrison's background for the first time, and what he discovered was heartbreaking. In February 2022, James Howard Harrison, a former deputy sheriff for the Lucie County Sheriff's Office, was identified by Detective Paul Taylor as the primary and sole suspect in the murder of 11-year-old Laura Anne Huizar. Since the 1960s, Harrison has served as a pastor and worked in 10 different law enforcement organizations. He was the last person to see Laura alive. He kidnapped her when she was walking home, sexually assaulted her, then killed her and dumped her body in a drainage ditch. It was discovered that Harrison was fired from the sheriff's office 5 months after Laura was murdered. At the time, he had been accused of sexually assaulting several young girls in his church. Co-workers at the sheriff's office had also complained about Harrison because they believed he had behaved inappropriately around young girls while performing his duties as a deputy. I'm actually standing there in front of this victim's family, and I'm telling them that one of our deputies is the one who did it. It's rough, a shocked Detective Taylor said. Unfortunately, Harrison passed away before the police could arrest him for the rape and murder of Laura Anne. He had died of cancer in 2008, but in the year 2020, the investigators obtained a warrant to exhume his body from the cemetery so that a DNA sample could be taken. However, by that time, the DNA from Laura's crime scene had deteriorated too much to match the sample taken from Harrison's body. However, they are certain that Laura Anne Huizar's murder was committed by former Deputy James Howard Harrison. The St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office has stated that they are certain that Harrison killed Laura Anne based on witnesses' accounts, evidence tampering, and a history of sexual assaults on young girls. Due to his inappropriate behavior with young adults, Detective Taylor claimed that Harrison was forced to resign from both his church and the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office 5 months after the murder of Laura Anne Huizar. Investigators entered Harrison's DNA into national and state databases. In order to ascertain how many more victims he had, his DNA is currently being tested in a number of Florida cold cases. After the Laura Anne Huizar cold case was formally closed, her older brother Joe was in total disbelief that his sister's killer could finally be revealed. It naturally was like a disbelief, a dream, after all this time. "You're telling me you're able to tell us who murdered our little sister?" Joe said. The Huizar family expressed their gratitude for Detective Paul Taylor's tireless efforts in solving this case, but they expressed their disappointment with what they perceived to be a poor quality investigation at the time Laura was killed. They also expressed their desire to question all the detectives who were on the case in 1983. From our perspective, things were purposefully overlooked and not done. There were such humongous gaps in the investigation, said the Huizar family. What do you think, guys? Did the former deputy abuse children throughout his entire life while serving as a deputy sheriff and holding a position of authority in the community as a preacher? How can we protect our women from these powerful men who take advantage of the systems and laws to further their own evil goals? Please share your opinions in the comment section below.